Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Legion video. Today we're going to be going through my favorite ranged DPS specs in Legion. Balance numbers are still changing, so this video is about how much fun these specs actually are to play. At the end of the day, games are meant to be fun, and balance changes happen so frequently that making a long-term choice based on what's currently good on the beta is, well, rather short-sighted. For a bit of background, I've mained a marksmanship hunter doing the Warlords of Draenor equivalent to heroic raids since Wrath of the Lich King, so that's the perspective that I come at this stuff with. And finally, I will be doing a melee DPS video similar to this one. However, if you want to see a sort of more complete look at all the specs and all the roles, definitely check out Preach's content. Anyway, let's get right into it with Balance Druids. So, Balance has had a full revamp since Warlords of Draenor, now relying on Astral Power as their primary resource. The new Balance Druid feels more controlled than its predecessor, and it's paired with a very satisfying artifacts weapon ability that's got great synergy with their core toolkit. As has been the case for a while, you start by applying your main dots to the target. These will do damage and generate astral power. Astral power is then spent on Star Surge if you're single target, or Star Fall if you're fighting 3 or more. Star Surge gives you a charge of solar and lunar empowerment, which is a buff that makes your next Solar Wrath and Lunar Strike a bit more powerful. There's also a number of pretty good talents which give you some choice. Some of them create some pretty fun gameplay. Overall, I just feel that it's a very satisfying do-over to Balance. It's a lot more engaging than the previous one to me. Instead of just chasing what an Eclipse bar is saying I should do, you are a little bit more in the driver's seat with this one. Another good point with the Druids is that you will be able to fulfill every single role in the game: melee DPS, range DPS, healing, and tanking. Overall, it's a very diverse class, and it's nice to see that its ranged DPS component has actually fared quite well in Legion. Next, the Elemental Shaman. I was not so fussed on this when I first checked it out, but now, a few months on, I've got to say that it really is in great shape. First of all, the spell effects and sound effects are some of the best in the game by far, and absolutely do succeed in selling the fantasy of controlling all these various different elements in battle. Gameplay-wise, you use a resource called Maelstrom, so it's a builder-spender spec. You build Maelstrom with your Lava Burst, Lightning Bolt, and Chain Lightning. You then spend it on maintaining Fire Shock in your target while building your way up to 100 Maelstrom. Earth Shock spends from 0 to 100 Maelstrom, and it hits like a truck if you use it at 100. So along with this core toolkit, there's a set of, I think, very compelling talent options, which do change up the playstyle of the spec in a satisfying manner. They provide new gameplay, and they do also allow people to choose a level of difficulty that they are comfortable with. Overall, I think it's a blast to play, and it's a spec that is complemented by the similarly well-designed Enhancement Shaman, which gives you very good melee DPS capability. Next up, we've got the Shadow Priest, and wow, Shadow Priests have went from not being interesting at all to me to being one of my favorite specs in the entire game. They've redesigned it around this mechanic called Insanity. Basically, you generate Insanity with your dots and your Mind Blast, and when you hit 100 Insanity, you'll be able to use an ability called Void Eruption, which will do a bunch of damage and put you into Void Form. Void Form is really fun. Now, it used to be you'd automatically go into Void Form. Now it happens on a button, and I think the spec does feel a little bit better with it being on the button, but even back in the older version when it turned on automatically, I still thought it was very cool. So, Void Form increases your damage, gives you access to an ability called Void Bolt, and it decreases your cooldowns and increases your haste by 1% for every second that you stay in Void Form. However, you will lose Insanity every second, and the rate at which you lose Insanity increases over time. So, the abilities that you use generate Insanity, so basically you have this race. You're losing Insanity every second, you're generating as much as you can, and your goal is to stay in Void Form for as long as you possibly can in order to benefit from the various different buffs that you get. And that pretty much is the crux of the spec, and the great thing is that it really is quite exciting, especially if you get a trinket proc or a cooldown lining up in Void Form. That means you can stay in there for ages. I think this will also scale pretty well over time, right? Because as you get more haste, as the expansion goes on, this spec will feel really fast. It already feels pretty fast and fun, so it should be pretty special by the time a few patches go on. And then we have Surrender to Madness. Now this is a talent that does two things. First, your insanity generating abilities generate double the insanity. Second, you can cast while moving. But you die if you leave Void Form. Basically, it's a 10-minute cooldown that will kill you if you use it, but will allow you to do absolutely insane amounts of burst damage, because the longer you stay in Void Form, the more haste that you have. This scales to crazy levels, especially if you're under the effects of Bloodlust or something at the same time. Absolutely a niche talent, but I do commend the ballsiness of its design. Next, I'm going to say mages. I know this video is kind of like my top 5 specs, but all the mage specs are similarly fun to me, and since they're all on the same class, it feels a little bit arbitrary just to throw two of them out of the video for the sake of hitting some number. So, none of these mage specs impress me as much as the other specs that I'll be covering in this video, but each of them has a strong niche and they are all executed quite well. For the most part, people who have played mages and warlords will know what they're getting into. Each spec plays with the same core mechanics as they sort of have in the past. Fire's all about getting crits to get yourself the instant Flame Strike or Pyroblast. The artifact weapon for Fire Phoenix Flames is disappointingly dull, but overall it's a pretty reactive spec, it's pretty fun, it's got some nice visuals too. Frost is also quite good, and while the names of some mechanics have been changed, it's mostly similar to Warlords. Thinkers of Frost will give you a pumped up Ice Lance, while Frostbolt has the chance of giving you a free, buffed, and instant use of Flurry. Essentially the same thing that was going on with Frostfire Bolt on live. It's quite satisfying to play, especially with some of the talents like Glacial Spike. And finally, Arcane is very, very familiar, however the role of mana has changed. It used to be that your damage was increased when you had more mana. That does not happen anymore. This spec actually surrounds how you conserve your mana. Essentially, Arcane charges generate as they did before, and they continue to make your spells do more damage but cost more mana. The gameplay within the Arcane Mage surrounds using all of your mana in a sensible way, such that by the time Evocation comes off cooldown, you're pretty much out of mana. It's a fun enough angle that I think is overall something that works quite well with the Arcane Mage gameplay. Now, it pairs quite well with a talent called Quickening. Quickening makes it so that Arcane Missiles, Arcane Explosion, and Arcane Blast give you 2% haste for 6 seconds, and that does stack up. But that extra haste is removed when you use Arcane Barrage. So it's pretty cool in that it increases your haste to the point where you will run out of mana before Evocation comes off cooldown, and it presents this kind of fun management challenge of how you manage your procs and just how you overall time it, especially when it comes to timing your haste stacks with your cooldowns coming off. Overall, I think the mages are quite solid, and they're in the fortunate position where every spec is good, so no matter which one is performing best, you'll actually have something to play. Next, the Marksmanship Hunter. Initially, I was not really a fan of the MM Hunter. Thankfully, that has improved drastically as the beta has progressed to the point where I think it actually does have some engaging gameplay. One downside is that the hunters visually are kinda terrible. I mean, they just don't hold up at all in comparison to the spectacle of an elemental shaman. That said, the gameplay, especially if you go down a few particular talent routes, does seem to be quite fun indeed. So the basics of the spec are that your focus generator can apply Hunter's Mark to the target, which allows you to use the marked shot on the target, which will increase the damage of your aimed shots on the target. Now by default this works okay enough, but it can be quite a bit more fun when you go for the patient sniper talent. Rather than last for 30 seconds, the vulnerability that's applied to your target lasts for 6 seconds. It no longer stacks, but it makes your marked and aim shots do 150% more damage. This pairs with a talent called Sidewinders really quite well. Sidewinders replaces Arcane Shot as your main focus spender. It generates 50 focus per use with 2 charges on a 12-second timer. It also applies vulnerability to the target, and it can give you a charge of a marked shot on the target as well. The interaction between these abilities is quite satisfying, and there's a nice enough little bit of skill in ensuring that you're always using your marked shots at the correct time so that you can get off 1 or 2 aimed shots before refreshing your vulnerability with marked shot, while vulnerability is still on the target but is about to run out, so that the marked shot that you do on the target will benefit from its effects. Overall, I think it works quite well, and doing AoE is actually pretty fun on the Marksmanship Hunter as well. The downside with Hunters is that BM, bar some basic focus, management, and some simple rules surrounding the usage of Kill Command, Dire Beast, and Bestial Wrath, is pretty simplistic. Survival is a bit hit or miss, to be honest, and I fear that its central mechanics surrounding Mongoose Bite might grow a little bit stale over time, but Marksmanship does appear to be the most competitive spec. That said, you know, choosing Hunter because it's competitive right now, that's going against the advice that I gave at the top of the video. It just seems to me like this is the one that Blizzard are probably going to be focusing on, because generally, you know, if a particular spec is really well received, they want to make that something that's actually playable in a raiding context, in comparison to things that have been less well received. Anyway, they are my current favorite ranged specs in the game. You've probably noticed that Warlocks are wholly absent. I didn't enjoy the final iteration of any of their specs that much at all, which is a little bit unfortunate, but yeah, there you go. That's it for this video. I think you will have a very fun time indeed if you play any of these specs, and it's nice to see that, you know, some of the Legion changes really have been for the better and really have made some just some really, you know, engaging and fun to play specs. So that's it for me. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and I will see you next time.